He returned from the grave after a 7-100-year slumber, only to discover that buried with him was not just an immortal legend, but also an ancient curse powerful enough to devour the entire world. As the heavy stone door slowly swung shut, propelled by an ancient incantation, the power of the magic coursed deep through the grooves on the walls and floor, forming a closed energy loop. The nightmarish world outside seemed to be completely sealed off. The roars of the guard captain could no longer be heard, nor could the screams of the injured and dying, much less the hisses and bellows of those terrifying monsters. All sounds were blocked by the heavy, thick stone and steel, although everyone knew this barrier was only temporary. In this moment of peace, Rebecca couldn't help but let out a long sigh, if only the hell outside were really just a nightmare. In the next second, however, Rebecca forcefully shook her head, casting aside the weak thoughts that had surfaced in her mind. The heavy stone and steel could not bring true, long-lasting security. On the contrary, they might weaken her will, allowing her to indulge in this fleeting illusion of safety. Thinking of this, the young heir of the Cecil family couldn't help but tighten her grip on the now dim staff in her hand, hoping this weapon could grant her more courage. The voice of the family knight, Byron Kirk, came from behind her. Viscontis, the passage is sealed. Those monsters shouldn't be able to get in for a while. Rebecca glanced back at the loyal knight. His steel armor was covered in scars with a sizable dent on the breastplate. A noticeable scorch mark could be seen on his short, grayish-white hair, a result of Aunt Hetty saving the knight from a monster's mole with a great fireball. The situation had been incredibly perilous. The fireball had exploded, almost grazing the mid-ranked knight's scalp. If not for the grace of the god of luck, this knight, who had served the family for 20 years, would likely have become a corpse. Of course, Rebecca couldn't be certain if this was due to Aunt Hetty's renowned magic that never hits its target constitution at play. Rebecca lowered her eyelids to hide the fatigue in her eyes, saying, "Thank you for your hard work, Knight Byron. We can at least catch our breath." She then turned back to survey the few people remaining by her side. 3 soldiers were holding torches, on guard against their surroundings. Aunt Hetty was holding a burning fireball, carefully examining the wall at the end of the stone hole, and the little scullery maid, Betty, who had followed them in a daze, was clutching the frying pan she had been carrying all along, timidly hiding behind the soldiers and curiously observing the place with her large, blinking eyes. Including herself and Knight Byron, these 7 people were likely the last survivors. Those left on the surface could not have survived. After confirming everyone's condition, Rebecca couldn't help but take a closer look at the stone hall. This was an ancient place. The rectangular stone hall was filled with cobwebs and thick dust, and a pile of decayed artifacts was stacked at one end. Though worn and tattered, their former exquisite and luxurious nature was still discernible. On the walls of the stone hall, well-preserved murals and reliefs could still be seen. Although the murals had faded and the reliefs were slightly worn, they were still clear enough to be viewed. Hetty Cecil had been carefully studying those murals and reliefs for a long time, compared to the flamboyant and frivolous style that had emerged in modern times from the northern kingdoms. All the decorations in this stone hall appeared solemn and simple, bearing the distinct air of the First Dynasty. The murals depicted heroic figures or local customs, while the reliefs carved scenes leaning toward mythology and abstract divine symbols. As a knowledgeable spellcaster, Hetty was adept at deciphering useful information from these ancient images. Looking at the content of the murals and reliefs, Hetty couldn't help but place her left hand on her chest and whisper, "May the ancestors forgive." Rebecca approached Hetty with her staff in hand. The young girl looked a bit nervous, as if she had only just realized what kind of place she had stepped into, and she grew slightly uneasy. She asked, "Aunt Hetty, this place is..." Hetty said with great seriousness, "This is the resting place of the Cecil family's ancestors. Do not commit any act of disrespect." Rebecca swallowed and looked around. It looks like no one has been in here for a very long time. Hetty gave Rebecca a deep look, saying, "Ever since Marquis Grum and took a holy relic from the ancestral tomb without permission and participated in the rebellion that nearly led to the family's ruin 100 years ago, this place has been completely sealed. Every descendant of the Cecil family knows the method to open it. But due to family decree, no one dares to enter without authorization unless it is a matter of life and death. In 100 years, we are the first to set foot in here." Rebecca took a deep breath. "Well, it really is a matter of life and death now. The ancestors will forgive us, right?" Hetty forced a stiff smile. She couldn't answer that question and had to continue searching for the mechanism to open the deeper tomb chamber, guided by the hints in the murals. It didn't take her much effort to find the special stone pillar. She then placed her hand on top of it and pressed down gently. The stone door leading to the deeper chamber immediately emitted a slight vibration, and then the entire stone slab slowly rose with a grinding sound. But just as the stone door rose, Rebecca heard a strange noise from behind it, the sound of an object falling to the ground, followed by a suppressed gasp. Hetty reacted instantly, shouting in a low voice, "Someone's inside, Byron?" Without waiting for further orders, the knight had already charged toward the stone door with his longsword in hand, the other 3 soldiers close behind him. After a moment of shock, Rebecca also charged forward, shouting back at the dazed little scullery maid without turning her head, "Betty, find a place to hide." As soon as she rushed into the tomb chamber, Rebecca saw Knight Byron, who had charged in ahead of her, swinging his sword at a small, agile figure. The small figure moved like the wind, darting left and right around Knight Byron, and occasionally dissolving into a cloud of black smoke to disappear into the ubiquitous shadows of the tomb. Her command of shadow power and the agility of her footwork were a real eye-opening experience for Rebecca. It was rare to see a rogue who could hold their own against Knight Byron for so long. However, as the remaining 3 soldiers completed their encirclement and Hetty, with a tongue of flame wrapped around her hand, blocked the chamber's entrance, the agile figure finally ran out of room to escape and landed clumsily on the ground. Only when she stopped did Rebecca get a clear look at the intruder's face. It was a young girl who looked about her own age but shorter. She wore a set of old leather armor and had ear-length short hair. Her face was beautiful, and although it was smudged with dirt, it was clear she was a budding beauty. Most striking were her ears. They were pointed, but not as long as an elf's, which was enough to reveal her lineage, a half-elf. But it was impossible to tell what her other half was. After all, the power of elven blood was so strong that the racial traits of offspring from unions with either humans or orcs were nearly identical. The moment the half-elf girl landed, Knight Byron stepped forward and placed his longsword against her neck. The other 3 soldiers immediately closed in, their 3 sharp swords sealing off all her escape routes. Hetty strode forward, her voice filled with irrepressible anger. "Who are you? How dare you trespass in the ancestral tomb of the Cecil family?" For a noble descendant like her, having the ancestral tomb visited by a grave robber was enough to make her see red. If word of this got out, the Cecil family's already crumbling reputation would be completely ruined. Rebecca also glared at the half-elf. Although the sudden event had left her a bit dazed, the presence of an outsider in the forbidden ancestral tomb was enough to make her angry. Pinned down by the longsword and glared at by Hetty and Rebecca, the half-elf girl's voice trembled. She said, wait a minute, I haven't stolen anything yet." Byron's longs were instantly pressed down a little harder. What audacity! Just as the knight finished speaking, a strange clattering sound suddenly came from the black steel coffin in the center of the tomb. The sound reached everyone's ears, and the group, including Rebecca, fell silent at once. A moment later, Rebecca was the first to react. A fist-sized fireball appeared at the tip of her staff, aimed at the half-elf kneeling on the ground. "What have you done to our ancestor?" This time, the half-elf girl was truly on the verge of tears. She cried, Don't kill me yet. More importantly, your ancestor's coffin lid is about to fly off." As the half-elf girl's tearful voice echoed, the sound from within the black steel coffin grew louder, and even the coffin lid began to tremble noticeably. Hetty's face turned pale. Ancestor. This lady, always known for her grace and elegance in noble circles, had never lost her composure like this before. "Please, rest in peace. Those who disturb you will be punished." The half-elf girl yelled frantically, "What's the use of saying all that now? Hurry up and hold your ancestor's coffin lid down." The 3 soldiers looked at each other, and even Byron looked bewildered. But Rebecca finally reacted. She dashed onto the platform where the coffin was placed, and at the same moment, the coffin lid was pushed completely open and a hand reached out from the gap. Without a second thought, Rebecca swung her staff in a wide arc and smashed it down. "Rest in peace, ancestor." The hand was immediately smashed back into the coffin, and a cry of pain came from within. "WTF, who hit my hand?" Rebecca looked up stunned to see her family knight, her aunt, and the 3 soldiers staring at her, mouths agape. Rebecca looked down at the staff in her hands, and now it was her turn to be on the verge of tears. Was I a little disrespectful to the ancestor? However, Hetty suddenly screamed, "Rebecca, get away from there." Rebecca was taken aback. "Auntie?" Hetty's face was deathly pale. This could be an resurrection. Perhaps those monsters from the surface have corrupted the ancestor's sacred remains. This possibility sent a cold sweat down Rebecca's spine, but just as she was about to jump off the platform and hide behind the soldiers, the heavy lid of the black steel coffin was pushed up again, and this time the person inside used their full strength, sending the entire coffin lid flying. Then, a man with short, light brown hair, a heroic and majestic face, and dressed in ancient noble attire sat up from inside. The half-elf girl, still kneeling on the ground, turned to see this scene and couldn't help but let out a long sigh. "See, your ancestor's totally come back as a zombie now." After sitting up from a suspicious black metal box, Gawain was in a state of severe confusion. In fact, even the act of sitting up had been done unconsciously. An unprecedented sense of chaos and dizziness was assailing his brain. He felt a constant buzzing in his ears, and a frantic and indistinguishable flood of sensations came from all over his body. Everything before him had at least 4 afterimages, 2 of which were in black and white, yet amidst all this chaos, his ability to think hadn't completely failed him. Perhaps he should be thankful for the blow someone had just dealt to the back of his hand. At the very moment he was about to be consumed by chaos, he gained a precious moment of clarity, but that blow had really hurt. As his thoughts gradually returned to normal, Gawain finally recalled what had happened before. The sudden loss of vision, the activation of some escape program, the illusion of constantly falling, and now this real tangible and movable body. A body, he had obtained a body After traversing who knows how many tens of thousands of years, even he was about to think he was born to have a third-person, top-down perspective, Gawain had acquired a body. The confusion in his mind was understandable, as was the chaotic sensory input from his entire body. For far too many years, he had possessed no sensory abilities other than sight. Even though his mind had remained sound for unknown reasons, it was difficult for him to adapt to the state of being able to feel cold, heat, pain, and itches. However, Gawain could feel that he was rapidly adapting to this body, to the sensations of returning to the material world. After the dizziness in his brain subsided a little, the forbidden quadruple vision finally returned to normal and his surroundings came into view. The first thing he saw were the four armed, burly men not far ahead. One of them was a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing what looked like sturdy steel armor with muscles almost bulging to his forehead and holding a silver gray longsword. The armor and weapons of the other three were clearly simpler, but showed signs of being standard issue. A petite girl was being held down on one knee by these four burly men, their swords pressing on her. Due to her hair and the angle, he couldn't see her face, but he could see the tip of a pointed ear peeking out from between the strands of her hair. Further away stood a woman in a long reed dress. Her beautiful face, with its elegant and mature temperament, and her curvaceous figure made Gawain take a second look. He soon noticed the undeniable nervousness and fear in the mature noblewoman's eyes. But a movement beside him quickly drew Gawain's attention. He turned his head just in time to see a girl who looked no older than 16 or 17 frantically jumping down from the stone platform where he was. The girl was holding a metal staff that looked like it would be very painful to be hit with. Considering where the girl had been standing before, a strange expression crossed Gawain's face. "Was that you who hit me just now?" As soon as he said it, he himself was taken aback. He realized that the language he had blurted out was not Chinese, but a language he had never heard before, yet it felt as familiar as if he had been born with it. Rebecca, however, had no idea how many chaotic thoughts were swirling in the old ancestor's mind. The noble girl who had just inherited the title of Viscountess and suffered a great calamity was on the verge of tears. "Ancestor, I'm so sorry." Gawain was still completely clueless about what was happening. Though he had stared at this world from the sky for many, many years, this was his first time seeing it from a first-person perspective. He said, His level of confusion was greater than anyone else's at the scene. "You are..." The beautiful noblewoman in the red dress seemed to be the calmest person present. After Gawain sat up and initiated conversation, the fear and nervousness on her face visibly diminished. Now, she took a step forward, though her face was still full of vigilance. She spoke calmly. "Do you know who you are?" Gawain paused, asking me. But just before he could subconsciously say his own name, he jolted, realizing he should now have a different identity. He looked at the box he was sitting on. Although its style was a bit strange, this thing was definitely a coffin. Then he looked at his surroundings, though it was more spacious than his home in his previous life. It looked very much like a tomb chamber. Recalling the expressions on the faces of the people around him, Gawain realized something. He had reanimated a corpse. If he were to say any name that didn't match the corpse he was possessing, he would surely be immediately killed as a demon or evil spirit. What did that little girl say earlier? Ancestor, right? He could boldly guess that he had possessed their ancestor's body. Never mind what their ancestor ate to keep his body from decomposing after all these years. The important thing was that he, an outside soul, had not only taken over their ancestor's body and slept in his tomb, but had also just kicked their ancestor's coffin lid off. If he were exposed, the word awkward wouldn't even begin to describe it. With this in mind, Gawain lowered his head, feigning deep thought, but was actually scrambling for an excuse, like his memory being a bit confused after a long slumber. But just as he focused his attention, a strong wave of dizziness hit him. He had just managed to adapt to his new body and shake off the dizziness, only for a second wave to hit him. He swayed and nearly fell back into the coffin. Seeing Gawain's strange behavior, the noblewoman in the long dress nervously raised her staff, looking as if she were about to unleash a mighty fireball on her own ancestor's face. But the deep voice that came from Gawain's mouth stopped her. He said, "Gawain Cecil, I am Gawain Cecil, a pioneer of the Ansu Kingdom. What era is it now?" As Gawain spoke, he slowly raised his head, his eyes as calm and deep as the sea. Inside his mind, however, waves were crashing. Memories belonging to Gawain Cecil were flooding out, but they were being quickly archived and recorded like files on a computer hard drive. In that brief moment of dizziness, he had read the most superficial parts of these files and knew the identity he should now have. His greatest surprise was the name of this body. It was also Gawain, except this Gawain had a surname Cecil. Was this some kind of coincidence? At this moment, Gawain had no time to ponder how miraculous this coincidence was, because memories of Gawain Cecil were still pouring out. He had to exert all his effort to control himself from fainting or showing a pained expression. In this dazed state, he vaguely heard the girl who had hit him with the iron staff answer, in a clear voice, "It's the year 735 of the Ansu calendar, ancestor. You've been asleep for over 700 years. Had he also breathed a great sigh of relief upon hearing Gawain's answer. As a spellcaster with extensive theoretical knowledge, she knew a bit about indeed resurrection. These blasphemous creatures had a fatal flaw in their souls. When they first awakened, most of them were unable to speak or think. Even the more powerful ones who quickly regained their cognitive abilities would have completely forgotten their past lives, and they could absolutely not say their own name, whether they regained their memory or were reminded by others. Once the dead spoke their living name, it would trigger a backlash and searing from their soul fire. Even if they were burned to death, the pain was unbearable even for the ND. Moreover, the phenomenon of the soul fire's backlash was impossible to hide, so she relaxed, but was still in a state of great confusion. Because if the ancestor before her was not resurrected as an indeed, then the current situation was even more inexplicable. Ancestor, how did you suddenly get up in the middle of being dead? But no matter how confused she was, the necessary courtesies had to be observed. So Hetty stepped forward and bowed with nervousness. Ancestor of the Cecil family, I am your descendant, Hetty Cecil. Beside me is also your descendant, Rebecca Cecil. Please do not hold her rash actions against her on account of her youth, and please forgive us for disturbing your long rest. So the one in front is my great-great-great-great-granddaughter, and the one next to her seems to be one too. The frantic infusion of memories seemed to have finally ended. Gawain couldn't be bothered to carefully read through the neatly arranged files in his mind right now. He wanted to understand the situation around him as quickly as possible. He held onto his coffin, trying to stand up while muttering, it's fine, I don't even know how I woke up myself. Could someone give me a hand? He realized he had overestimated his ability to adapt to his new body. He tried to push himself up but couldn't, which was a bit embarrassing. Rebecca, who had been standing by nervously with her staff, saw her chance to shine. She immediately hopped onto the stone platform and while holding Gawain by the arm said, let me help you out of the coffin, let me help you out of the coffin. It sounded so awkward no matter how you heard it. Gawain, feeling stiff all over, was helped out of the coffin by the young girl. He said, over 700 years, huh? He looked down at his clothes, his observation making Rebecca very confused. What material is this fabric? Rebecca said, uncertainly, I think it's self-woven moon trace cloth. Truly black technology. Rebecca asked, huh? Rebecca thought her ancestors' words were very profound. With Rebecca's help, Gawain finally stepped down from the stone platform and stood firmly on the ground. He could feel his control over this body improving rapidly, as if his soul was quickly installing drivers. His mind and body were coordinating at an astonishing speed. He let go of Rebecca's hand and tried to take a small step forward on his own. The next moment he was almost moved to tears. If there had been a microphone nearby, he felt he could have thanked everyone he knew and every TV station without repeating himself once. All these years, a transmigrator in a novel would have already been slaying gods, vanquishing Buddhas, and unifying the universe, yet he had just completed his first challenge as a human, upright walking. And only after achieving the feat of upright walking did he remember the little girl he had almost forgotten, the one surrounded by burly men. Gawain felt his condition rapidly improving. His mind was gradually clearing, and his control over his body had reached a point where he could move freely. He finally had the energy to pay attention to the girl who was still being held captive. By the way, what's going on here? The half-elf girl had been trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, hoping that these Ceciless, in the great shock of meeting their ancestor, would forget about someone digging up their family tomb. But before she could find a chance to slip away, Gawain's gaze fell upon her. The unlucky thief could only shrink her neck and put on a pitiful expression. I just wanted to come in and hide for a bit. Hetty immediately glared and said to Gawain, hiding requires you to drill all the way into the deepest tomb chamber. Ancestor, it was this despicable grave robber who desecrated your resting place and disturbed your slumber. Gawain paused, his gaze toward the half-elf girl turning strange. So, you're the one who woke me up? If not for the constraints of human anatomy, the thief would have wanted to retract her head into her pelvic cavity. Her voice trembled. I really didn't do anything. At first, I just wanted to find a safe place to hide, but after getting in, my professional habits kicked in by accident, and that's how I ended up in the tomb chamber. But even after getting into the tomb chamber, I didn't. Gawain thought for a moment and said, very seriously, in any case, thank you. The thief asked, huh? Everyone, including Rebecca and Hetty, asked what? Gawain said, let her go. It's not a good look for 4 grown men to hold down a little girl like this. After saying thank you, he realized something was off, but he couldn't take it back, so he had to press on. It's not in the spirit of chivalry. Yes, the spirit of chivalry. Hesitation flashed across Hetty's face. But ancestor, she is? Gawain said with a wave of his hand, I, for one, would like to thank her for waking me from my slumber. Let her go. If I have no objections, what more is there to say? Knight Byron gave the Cecil ancestor a strange look, but finally at Hetty's signal he withdrew his longsword. The 3 soldiers beside him also stepped back. The half-elf girl looked around, making sure this wasn't some kind of prank, before cautiously standing up and confirming with Gawain, you're the elder here. You have to keep your word. Don't you go back on it? A muscle in Hetty's eye twitched. It took years of cultivated aristocratic composure to restrain herself from beating this grave robber to a pulp. Gawain looked at the girl curiously. From the memories he had just inherited, he could tell her race should be a half-elf. What's your name? The half-elf girl blinked. Amber. Gawain stroked his chin. Amber? That does have a bit of a wood elf style to it. At that moment, Hetty suddenly spoke up, interrupting the conversation between Gawain and the self-proclaimed Amber. Ancestor, I must interrupt you. This is not the time for idle chat. We are not safe right now. Gawain tried to immerse himself in his new identity. He looked at Hetty seriously. What happened outside? Rebecca, who had been silent for a while, said loudly, "It's monsters. Monsters swarming from the sea, while impasse in the mining mountains. The territory's army and patrol teams are no match for them by now. The outside is probably completely occupied by those things." Hetty added, "We organized as much resistance as we could, and before the situation completely collapsed, we had Knight Philip led a group of soldiers to cover the civilians' evacuation. But before the second group of evacuees could leave, the monsters destroyed the drawbridge. Rebecca and I did not disgrace the Cecil family name, and neither did these brave soldiers. We fought in the castle until the very last moment. It was only when the gate to the inner courtyard was breached that we had to retreat here." Gawain then asked a few more questions and finally pieced together the outline of the whole event. This was the ancestral territory of the Cecil family, passed down from the first ancestor, and the little girl next to him with the iron staff who looked like a high school student, Rebecca, was actually the current lord of this territory. When the monsters attacked, this young lady did her best to organize a resistance, but it clearly failed. The monsters eventually destroyed all defenses and slaughtered all humans in their path. After the first group of survivors was evacuated, Rebecca, adhering to her duties as a lord, was trapped in the castle with the last of her soldiers. They fought for a long time, but eventually the castle was breached, and they had no choice but to retreat into the ancestral tomb beneath the castle. And then they happened to run into him, possessing a corpse. As for the beautiful noblewoman named Hetty, she was actually Rebecca's aunt. But these generational relationships meant nothing to Gawain. They were all his great-great-great-great-great-granddaughters anyway. One more or one less great made no difference. As for the half-elf named Amber, she was indeed a thief. But this time, she really was just looking for a place to take refuge. It's just that this thief's professional skills were so superb that she managed to drill all the way into the deepest chamber of the Cecil family's ancestral tomb. Gaul unrubbed his forehead, contemplating how to resolve the current crisis while searching his mental memory banks for any helpful information. He said, "So I wake up to this mess. So those monsters have completely taken over the surface, and going out is a dead end. Speaking of which, you keep calling them monsters, but what exactly are those things?" Hetty said, "I speculate they are some subspecies of demon. But demons haven't appeared in the material world for many years, especially not on such a large scale. I can't be certain." Rebecca, however, clutched her staff and looked at Gawain with a hopeful gaze. "Ancestor, can't even your power deal with the monsters outside?" Gawain was taken aback for a moment. "Wait." Rebecca's eyes almost started to sparkle. "Yes, according to the legends, aren't you the most powerful knight in the Ansu kingdom and even the entire northern continent? It said that back then you killed the barbarian Grand Marshal Golgi with a single strike of your sword." Gawain quickly searched his memories and was astonished to find that Gawain Cecil was actually a legendary level powerhouse. He was one of the greatest heroes of the Ansu Kingdom's pioneering era and one of the earliest pioneers of what was known as the Second Pioneering Period. In the Dark Ages, when the ancient Gondar Empire collapsed, its people returned to a state of chaos and barbarism, and the light of human civilization was gradually being swallowed by the chaotic tide spreading from the continent's heartland. This Gawain Cecil, along with a group of other powerful figures of the time, lead the surviving humans to escape the ruins of the collapsed empire and marched in for directions. The group that headed north became the ancestors of the Ansu Kingdom, and Gawain Cecil was among them. His life was extremely short, but incredibly brilliant. He set out as a 15-year-old boy, becoming the youngest pioneer knight of his time. Alongside the other pioneer knights and the first king of Ansu, he carved a path through thorns and brambles, spending 10 years establishing a new nation in the north of the continent and pulling humanity back into civilization and order. After the founding of Ansu, he became one of the kingdom's 7 generals guarding the southern frontier and repelling more than a dozen counterattacks from the Dark Tide without a single defeat. However, such a brilliant life was like a candle burning too fiercely. This legendary figure only lived to the age of 35, dying of exhaustion in his final battle against the Dark Tide. The inherited memories ended there. That was the life of this powerhouse. Gawain felt it, which it is temple. He had possessed an incredible person. There was no smugness, no trepidation. After a brief moment of astonishment, his biggest reaction was actually a lack of confidence. Rebecca was looking at him with hope, and Amber had the same expression. Even the most mature and composed-looking Lady Hetty gazed at him with expectation and trust. But they were looking at Gawain Cecil, not Gawain. Gawain looked down at his own hands. They were the hands of a warrior, broad, strong, with thick calluses, but he didn't know how much power he could exert when controlling this body. However, this state of uncertainty did not last long because Gawain's own memories became active, memories spanning tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. Although the substantive content of these memories was probably not much, it was enough for him to quickly adjust his mindset and be filled with self-confidence. He admitted that he was a bit stunned by Gawain Cecil's legendary life, but what he needed right now was not shock and wavering, but to be firm in himself. The source of this confidence was simple. He had been watching this world since before its intelligent creatures even learned to walk upright. He knew these memories wouldn't be of any substantial help, but at this moment all he needed was to give himself a push. And with that push he had to find a way to survive. Once he calmed down, a solution would naturally present itself. He soon found something useful in the memories of Gawain Cecil. Gawain said, seriously stroking his chin, fighting our way out is unrealistic. I've been slumbering for too long and may not be able to exert much of my strength. Besides, we can't be sure how powerful the monsters outside are, so the best way is to find a path that bypasses them and gets us to a safe place. Rebecca said, but the drawbridge has been destroyed, and the other paths are also blocked. Gawain waved his hand, interrupting his great-great-something granddaughter underground. The Cecil territory was once part of the kingdom's southern defense line. There's a secret tunnel system underground here, its main body blessed by earth elementals, so it wouldn't have collapsed even after 1,000 years. And the entrance to this secret tunnel is beneath the castle. Rebecca's face lit up with surprise. There's something like that? Then what are we waiting for? Let's go find the tunnel. Ancestor, you lead the way. Gawain unspread his hands. But there's a problem. I only know the way from the castle, but I don't know the path from here in the tomb. Rebecca looked surprised. You've lived here for so long and you don't know the way? Gawain was speechless. Knight Byron and the soldiers were speechless. Hetty turned pale, thinking that the ancestor was highly likely to be angered to death by this disappointing descendant. Gawain didn't know if the girl named Rebecca had taken a blow to the head when fighting the monsters earlier, but he patiently explained, although I've lived here for many years, I was already dead back then. Can you know what your own grave looks like after you die? Rebecca thought for a moment. She wanted to remind her old ancestor that the mausoleum of the founding monarch of Ansu was built while the king was still alive, and the king himself had even participated in the design. But after careful consideration, she felt that if she kept talking back, she'd likely be beaten to death on the spot by Aunt Hetty. So she forced the words back down her throat and instead smiled awkwardly. That makes sense. Hetty sighed and analyzed calmly, we can't go back the way we came now. The castle's central courtyard and the entrance to the ancestral tomb have been taken by those monsters. Going back that way is a dead end. Gawain said while recalling his inherited memories, we must find another way. It's been 700 years. The structure of the castle on this land is probably not what it was back then. Hetty quickly replied, the upper structure has been renovated several times, but the foundation hasn't been touched. The entrance you mentioned should still be in the same place. Gawain said, is that so? Then it's much simpler. He then reached out to a nearby soldier, lend me your sword. Taking the sword from the soldier, Gawain began to sketch on the ground. He first drew a top-down view of the castle's outline, then a side view roughly divided into 3 levels. Although they were hastily drawn sketches, the division of the major sections was quite clear. He explained, the entrance is at this position, 2 levels underground, next to the wine cellar and granary. Well, what used to be the wine cellar and granary? There are 2 passages to get inside, but both require you to walk on the surface, so they're probably not viable. Rebecca looked curiously at the sketch Gawain had drawn offhandedly. That area is still a wine cellar and granary now, but I never knew there was a 3rd room between them. Gawain smiled. It's not a room, but a hidden mezzanine using some small architectural tricks concealed between the walls and support beams. In those days, this land was not peaceful. This was a border region. Monsters and crazed old imperial soldiers from the wastelands of the Gander Empire would attack almost every 10 days or half a month. The earliest Cecil territory was built almost to the standards of a war fortress. Under such circumstances, secret passages and hidden walls were essential. They could be used for emergency evacuation or for transporting supplies during a siege. Knight Byron studied the simple map carefully, then drew his own Longsworth and began outlining on the map's lower left. So we need to get to the entrance on the castle's 2nd sub-level, and we can't pass through any surface routes including the central courtyard. This is where we are now. The ancestral mausoleum is an underground structure built southeast of the castle, with about a third of it overlapping with the castle's foundation. Gawain interrupted Byron, there should be a passage in this overlapping area. The mausoleum was built 700 years ago, and the craftsmen back then were the same ones who built the war fortress. These buildings were also constructed according to the standards and rules of that era. A backup passage must exist. As he spoke, he gave Rebecca a strange look. You really know nothing about this. This should be knowledge passed down through the Cecil family for generations. Rebecca lowered her head in shame. Hetty bit her lip and said with some difficulty, Ancestor, we have failed the glory you once won for the family. The Cecil family has gone through many things in these 700 years. Gawain waved his hand, saying, all right, I understand. This isn't the time for storytelling. After we leave here, I'll have a good long talk with you both to understand what happened over the past 700 years. The immediate priority now is to find the path from the mausoleum to the secret passage. Rebecca, Hetty, and Byron crouched before the simple maps, studying them. But while they knew the Cecil family's old castle, they were unfamiliar with the structure of the tomb. This 700-year-old mausoleum wasn't a tourist attraction with a 2 silver coin entrance fee. Forget about dropping by every now and then. Even before the tomb was sealed 100 years ago, a family heir had only a limited number of opportunities in their lifetime to enter the mausoleum's interior, and even then they weren't allowed near the ancestors' resting place. Who would know where the secret passage was? Faced with this problem, even Gawain's memories were useless. After all, when he died back then, he certainly didn't think he'd have to crawl back up one day and figure out a way to get out. But just as the few of them were at a loss, Amber, who had been standing quietly by the side, suddenly spoke up, "Hey, I might know the way." Instantly, everyone in the tomb turned their eyes to the half-elf thief. Amber immediately shrank her neck. Hetty frowned. "How would you know?" Amber was a little scared, but after seeing Gawain's encouraging gaze, she grew bolder, saying, I snuck in from that direction. It should be about right. I guess that must be the secret passage." Gawain nodded. "Very good, you lead the way." Amber patted her chest. "As long as you don't hold the fact that I dug up your family's ancestral tomb against me." Hetty glared at the tactless half-elf, raised her staff, and turned to walk towards the tomb chamber's entrance, while Gawain paused just before taking a step. Rebecca looked at him curiously. "Ancestor?" Gawain said, "I need to carry a weapon too." Although he wasn't the legendary Grand Duke who had pioneered new lands 700 years ago, he still had the common sense to find a weapon for self-defense in this dangerous place. His gaze swept across the tomb chamber. A soldier proactively unfastened and the sword at his waist, ready to hand it over, but Gawain waved his hand, declining the soldier's kind offer. Guided by his memories, he went to the side of the black steel coffin and reached inside to feel around. He found a heavy longsword in the coffin that was entirely pitch black, except for a faint crimson glow near the hilt. The moment the longsword was in his hand, a sense of familiarity and ease washed over him, as if every line on the sword's grip perfectly matched the lines on his palm. Gawain unsubconsciously swung the longsword a couple of times, each swing as if it had been honed through 1,000 trials. He knew this was the memory left in his current body. Even though the soul had changed, every muscle still remembered how to use this weapon. This could be called a surprise, but it wasn't entirely unexpected. Besides the residual memories in the body, he could also find all of Gawain Cecil's combat knowledge in his mind, not only basic swordsmanship and equestrian skills, but also supernatural powers that seemed almost like magic to Gawain. This part was undoubtedly exciting. However, now was not the time for experimentation and learning. Let's get out of this awful situation first. When Rebecca saw the black longsword, her eyes widened and her voice even trembled slightly. "Is this the legendary sword of the Ansu pioneer?" Hearing Rebecca's voice, Hetty, who had already walked to the doorway, instantly turned back. She stared intently at the sword in Gawain's hand, her face unable to hide her excitement. "The pioneer's sword." Gawain sighed. "Now it's just a sharper sword, that's all. It's been 700 years. Even if a weapon blessed by elves doesn't get worn or corroded, the magic within it has long dissipated. Who knows how long it will take to recharge." As he spoke, Gawain turned to look in front of the coffin. There was a small stone platform there, but it was empty, which made Gawain frown instantly. "Wait, shouldn't I also have a shield that never leaves my side? Wasn't it buried with me? How is my huge shield gone?" The expression on Hetty's face instantly became unsightly. "Ancestor, your descendants have once again failed your favor. The shield of the Ansu Kingdom's guardian was taken from the mausoleum by your descendant, Gawain Cecil, 100 years ago, and was subsequently lost on the battlefield." Hetty spoke hesitantly, clearly holding back many things, perhaps worried that revealing the major incident from 100 years ago would cause the ancestor before her to die of a sudden fit of anger. Though with a coffin right there, reburial would be easy. Gawain could sense Hetty's hesitation, but didn't point it out. Instead, he frowned and cursed, "What a good-for-nothing descendant." Good thing the sword was in the coffin, that Gawain wasn't deranged enough to pry open his ancestor's coffin to complete the set. Hetty and Rebecca could only lower their heads with sweat on their brows, listening. The ancestor jumping out of his coffin to curse their great-grandfather was an event that had seriously transcended the realm of fantasy. For the younger generation, even taking a breath felt incredibly stressful. Fortunately, Gawain was only annoyed because he was missing a piece of equipment that might have been useful. After cursing once, he said no more and instead lead everyone out of the tomb chamber. After leaving the tomb chamber and arriving in the stone hole, Rebecca looked around and then beckoned towards a corner of the wall. "Betty, come on out, it's safe now." Gawain looked over curiously and saw a thin, small girl who looked possibly even younger than Rebecca timidly walking out from the shadows of the corner. The little girl wore a cloth dress, had a few adolescent freckles on her face, and her flaxen hair was loose down her back. She tightly gripped the frying pan in her hands. Upon seeing Gawain, the little girl called Betty clearly showed hesitation and nervousness on her face. Her not-so-bright mind probably couldn't figure out where this suddenly appeared stranger had popped out from. Rebecca briefly introduced the little girl. "She's a maid from the castle. We don't know how she was left behind by the first group that broke through, but she just followed along in a daze." "Betty, this is..." A slight tremor from above the mausoleum interrupted Rebecca's words. Gawain raised his longsword and looked at Amber, saying, "This is not the time to talk. Now, lead the way." The excellent master of stealth techniques, professional in shadow powers, an enthusiast of grave digging, Miss Amber had a golden rule: the path is right there, a door is but an ethereal decoration. As long as you overcome the psychological barrier, even the gate to the royal treasury only requires a stalk of celery. Alright, this world probably doesn't have celery, but for Amber, prying open the gate of an ancient mausoleum didn't require celery either. With just a little shadow, trickery, some knowledge of ancient wards, and a tiny bit of luck, this half-elf thief easily broke the wards in the Cecil ancestral tomb. A passage that even Hetty and Rebecca didn't know about appeared before everyone. Then everyone followed Amber into this passage. The tomb passage, built from rock and soul-suppressing bricks, was much more spacious than expected. Even heavily armored knights like Gawain and Byron, who were nearly 2 meters tall, didn't feel cramped in the passage. The enchanted sconces embedded in the walls on both sides had long run dry, but after Hetty cast a few basic spells, these ancient sconces, which were 700 years old, lit up one by one, indicating the way forward. Amber walked at the front of the group, saying humbly as she went, "I'm really just a petty thief, usually just trying to make a living. I'm a descendant of the Wood Elves. You know, I have great respect for ancestral spirits. How could I do something like digging up graves?" Gaw and dismissed her claims with contempt. "You're so skilled at it, and you still have the nerve to explain?" Perhaps confirming that her life was now safe. This half-elf, who had no sense of racial pride, was as thick-skinned as the tomb where she had just pried open, lockpicking and ward-breaking are standard skills in our line of work. Is it my fault that my fundamentals are solid? Just then, Rebecca, who was walking in the middle of the group, suddenly asked, "Are you a citizen of the Cecil territory?" Amber frowned and thought for a moment. "I've lived in this place for several years, but I've never applied to become a formal citizen. But according to your Cecil territory's rules, anyone who has lived here for more than 3 years and pays taxes on time is considered a citizen. So, do you think I count?" Rebecca shook her head. "If you haven't applied, then you don't count." Amber drew out the sound. "Oh, then why are you asking me this?" Rebecca said very seriously, "I am the lord of the Cecil territory. So if you were my citizen, I would have an obligation to protect you." Amber said, "Then you should have said so earlier." "Is it too late for me to change my answer now?" Rebecca said with a serious face, "It's too late." Gaw unglanced at the serious-faced Rebecca, then at the completely shameless Amber, and shook his head with some amusement. Although he had woken up in such a mess, the feeling of being human again was much better than that damn state he was in before. He looked at Hetty, who was walking behind him. This great-great-something granddaughter of his had secretly glanced his way more than once. He had been waiting for her to speak up, but seeing that she still hadn't broken the silence, he had to ask first. "If you want to ask something, just say it." Hetty was slightly startled, but quickly took a deep breath to calm down. She looked at Gawain's face, which was identical to the one in the family portrait, and carefully chose her words. "Ancestor, I still find it hard to believe. Are you really?" Gaul unshrugged. "That's right. I'm really that Gawain Cecil, the pioneer from 700 years ago. I can recite my 30-plus years of life experience for you, or do you want me to tell you about the second pioneering era?" But honestly, even that probably wouldn't prove anything. A good historian might be more convincing than me after all. I'm not very eloquent. You just want to confirm if I'm real, right? And he said hastily, "Please forgive my doubts. But this is really a bit. Although stories of heroic spirits returning have been told since ancient times, seeing it with one's own eyes is a completely different matter. I've heard that some paladins and silver moon elves can achieve a state of suspended animation for several or even dozens of years, preserving their souls and life force with the power of the holy light and elven secret arts. But I've never heard of a human knight being able to do the same, let alone you've been dead for 700 years. Gawain shook his head and said, "To be honest, I don't know what happened either." Although he really wanted to invent a logically tight, well-founded, and convincing theory on the spot to fool his great-great-great-great-granddaughter, he couldn't find any usable theory from either his own knowledge or Gawain Cecil's memories. So he simply admitted that he couldn't explain it all. "Perhaps it's related to something I experienced in my life. You know, I once received the blessings of the elements when leading the people to pioneer the wilderness. That probably changed my constitution." Hetty said non-committally, "Is that so?" She then suddenly raised her head and looked at the path ahead. She said in a low voice, "There's an airflow, and a different kind of mono-reaction. The end of the mausoleum area should be up ahead." Gaw nodded, and at the same time, tightened his grip on the pioneer's sword. An indescribable sense of foreboding made him feel that the path ahead was probably not safe. Knight Byron, who was walking at the very front with Amber, seemed to have sensed something as well. He drew his broadsword of fine steel, and as he casually brushed his other hand over the blade, a faint silver light immediately rose from it. "Be on high alert. You three, protect the rear." A sound of metal clashing rang out as the 3 soldiers prepared for battle. Although they were only basic combat professions, they were elite warriors who had survived to the end of the battle against the monsters and had been carefully trained by the Cecil family. The fearlessness and composure on their faces at this moment quickly calmed the somewhat nervous Amber and the little maid Betty, who was protected in the very center of the group. The tomb's corridor, though deep and long, eventually came to an end. The soul-suppressing bricks embedded every 10 meters on both sides of the stone walls marked the mausoleum area. and as these bricks disappeared, a slightly more open area resembling a crossroads appeared ahead. This was the junction between the Mausoleum area and the castle's underground section, and also the hub leading to those ancient secret passages. Amber pointed to one of the forks in the crossroads. I snuck in from that way. It leads to a dry well outside the castle, but that side is definitely occupied by monsters now. Gawain looked at Hetty, which way is west. Hetty sketched a simple magic rune in the air, and the rune then transformed into a glowing ribbon that swayed and pointed in a certain direction. Gawain said that's the way, but just as his voice fell, a sense of crisis suddenly surged in his heart. Without any time for further thought, his battle-hardened body reacted faster than his mind. Gawain almost instinctively raised the pioneer sword to block, and immediately felt an impact like a heavy hammer strike coming from the blade. His body swayed slightly, then he steadied himself, and the attacker finally appeared before them, accompanied by a series of indistinct, whispering sounds. Three tall, staggering figures emerged from one of the dark corridors at the crossroads. Their appearance was unlike that of any creature in the natural world, looking more like a monstrous creation pieced together by the evil creativity of necromancers and demonologists. They were nearly 3 meters tall, like shriveled, deformed giants, but their bodies were formed from a fluid, amorphous substance like mud. This sludge-like substance churned and flowed on their surfaces, and from time to time, huge cavities would appear, within which blood-red skeletons could be seen. Upon seeing these 3 monsters, Rebecca let out a short gasp, while Betty quickly bit her lip, looking as if she might burst into tears from fright at any moment. Hetty struck the ground heavily with her staff, activating a weak cleansing mind spell to counteract the fear effect the monsters were inflicting on everyone. At the same time, she quickly said to Gawain Ancestor, "These are the monsters." By this time, Gawain had recovered from the initial shock of seeing an unhuman monster, and a corresponding memory surfaced in his mind. So it's these things? At this moment, the 3 monsters had launched another attack. They continuously emitted dream-like whispers, and 2 of them charged towards Born's group while the remaining monster raised its arm. A bolt of dark energy coalesced in front of its arm and in the next second flew straight towards Amber, who was standing at the very front of the group. Amber let out a short cry, and her entire body instantly shrank into the shadow behind Knight Byron, repairing in another patch of shadow 10 meters away in the next moment. Knight Byron, on the other hand, raised his silver glowing broadsword and with a roar charged to meet one of the oncoming monsters. Gawain shouted loudly, "Hetty, Rebecca, take out the one that shoots shadow bolts. Try not to use arcane magic. Arcane magic is almost useless against these things. Amber, you and the soldiers protect the spellcasters." Then he swung his longsword and charged forward, steeling himself. He had never fought with a sword before. He had also never seen any non-human monsters. Despite having been transmigrated and reborn, it was only today that he stood on the soil of this other world on his own 2 feet for the first time. So he had no idea what he could accomplish at this moment. Relying on a bit of combat instinct remaining in his body, combat knowledge in his mind that wasn't his own, and an ancient longsword that had lost its magic. But often, fate doesn't give you a choice. You're standing here, the monster is standing there, there's no escape route, and all you have in your hand is a 700-year-old antique sword. You could have had a shield, but it was lost by a good-for-nothing descendant 100 years ago. What else can you do in this situation? Charge at those bastards. So what if they're abominations? 700 years ago, Gawain Cecil could take on 100 of them by himself. Today there are only 3, can't he handle them? When he charged towards the grotesque and bizarre monster with his longsword in hand, Gawain's heart was free of nervousness, hesitation, and fear. If there was anything, it was perhaps a slight sense of an unreality. He still clearly remembered the moment his plane crashed. He still clearly remembered the hundreds of thousands of years he spent suspended high above this world. He had not yet fully adapted to the identity of Gawain Cecil that had fallen upon him from the sky. Yet at this moment, he gripped an ancient family longsword and charged at a strange monster that was either a demon or an indeed. Bang! A huge impact came from the blade, and all distracting thoughts in his mind instantly vanished. With an almost instinctive reaction, he dodged the monster's sweeping claws. Gawain then twisted his upper body a little, and the deflected sword blade drew an arc of light through the air, fiercely striking the monster's shoulder. As the blade descended, he tried to mobilize the power stored in this body and channel it into the sword in his hand. The faint red hue at the base of the blade, stimulated by the power, bloomed into a brilliant red light, which spread rapidly along the blade like a flame. Under the scorching heat, even the surrounding air began to distort. The 3-meter tall monster sensed the threat from the high temperature of the blade, and with an agility that completely belied its massive size, it suddenly leaned back. As a result, Gawain's cleaving strike missed by a hair's breadth. Having unleashed such a magical, supernatural power with his own hands for the first time, Gawain couldn't help but feel a momentary surge of excitement and exhilaration. It was probably this brief moment of excitement that caused him to mishandle the timing of his first attack. However, he quickly adjusted his mindset and once again infused power into his longsword. The skills and knowledge from Gawain Cecil's memories were indeed accessible, and this body had not deteriorated to the point where it couldn't exert any of its power. Although he didn't know what percentage of his strength he could bring to bear, Gawain's confidence had greatly increased at this moment. He began to immerse himself in the battle, striving to convert the combat experience in his mind, which wasn't his own, into usable power as quickly as possible. On the other side, however, Byron was already in a tough fight. This mid-ranked knight was one of the top experts in the Cecil territory. His combat career before pledging allegiance to the Cecil family had also endowed him with extraordinary battle experience. However, he had already expended too much energy during the monster attack on the castle, and the corrosion from the monster's strange magic had further aggravated the internal injuries in his body, reducing his combat effectiveness. This meant the knight could only bring out 4 or 5/10 of his full fighting strength. Now, facing the monster's relentless onslaught, he could only grip his longsword tightly and struggle to hold his ground, conserving his stamina as much as possible while searching for his opponent's weakness. Rebecca gathered her magic, and a fireball the size of a human head flew from the front of her staff, violently colliding with the spellcasting monster's shadow bolt in mid-minus air, erupting in a deafening explosion. She then caught her breath and immediately noticed the dangerous situation on Byron's side. She shouted loudly to the territory soldiers beside her, "You 3, go help Byron." One of the soldiers hesitated for a moment, "But my lady," Rebecca shouted while gathering a new fireball spell, "we're fine for now on this side, but if Byron falls, we're all finished. I command you as your lord to go." The 3 soldiers had no choice but to obey, joining Knight Byron in confronting the terrifying monster. Gawain gradually became immersed in the battle. The memories and experiences in his mind that were not his own were rapidly transforming into his own, improving his control over his new body. This process brought him a great sense of accomplishment. By the time he emerged slightly from this immersive state, he found that he was now pressing the monster before him. The abomination's body with its churning mud was not invulnerable. It would be injured when struck, and it would die if struck enough times. Although they were immensely strong and had the advantage of size, as long as one mastered the method to fight them, a human body could still destroy them. This was the experience left from 700 years ago. The monster's claws swept over his head. Gawain ducked, and, in a backhanded motion, thrust his longsword into his opponent's thigh. The latter finally let out a guttural roar, its body uncontrollably tilting to one side. Taking this opportunity, Gawain shouted loudly to Byron, "Aim for their abdomens and lower limbs, ignore the chest, these things don't have hearts." Then, as his opponent lost its balance, he twisted and circled around to its side and rear, raising his longsword to strike at the monster's lower back. He continued, "Besides the abdominal cavity, their other weak point is in the back, the lower back." Hearing the guidance from the Cecil family's ancestor, Byron was immediately invigorated. With the coordination of the 3 soldiers, he quickly contained the monster's movements, and, at the cost of having his shoulder armor pierced by its claws, he slid directly under its legs and struck a vital point with a backhanded sword strike. And a second before Byron finished off his enemy, the monster in front of Gawain also fell heavily. After finishing off the enemy, Gawain immediately looked up at the distant monster that was exchanging shadow bolts and fireballs with Rebecca. But just as he was about to charge in for a frontal assault, the monster suddenly let out a piercing shriek and then collapsed, convulsing. Amber's figure appeared behind the monster, twirling a poison-coated steel dagger in each hand. A poke to the chrysanthemum, "I'm good at that." Rebecca lowered her staff, her cheeks slightly flushed from continuous spellcasting. She took a couple of breaths to steady herself, then seriously corrected. The ancestor said lower back, not chrysanthemum. Amber spun the daggers in her hands quickly, and they disappeared somewhere on her person. She stepped over the monster's corpse and walked over, pouting in PH, no sense of humor at all. After the monsters died, they began to disintegrate rapidly. The constantly flowing, mud-like substance on their bodies first stopped moving, then gradually dried, hardened, and developed numerous fine cracks. As this mutated flesh decayed and fell away, it would very quickly turn into a set of huge, twisted, blood-colored skeletons. Gawain stood beside the monster he had killed, looking down at this process, and said as if to himself, "So these are the things that attacked the Cecil territory." Hetty looked at him curiously, "Ancestor, do you know the origin of these monsters?" Gawain had already shown a deep understanding of these monsters during the previous battle, even giving Byron pointers on how to fight them, so this was naturally something he couldn't hide, nor did he intend to. Gawain said, as he started walking forward, "It's possible we'll encounter them again if we stay here. Let's get into the secret passage first. There's something in there that suppresses those monsters. They won't go in easily. I can tell you the details on the way." It was only after they had entered the ancient underground passage and walked for some distance that Gawain broke the silence. "I did indeed deal with them back in my day. In fact, they were the main things we dealt with back then. You should know about the collapse of the Gondar Empire in the history of the Second Pioneering, right?" Rebecca immediately nodded, her history lessons being a required course for her as a noble child. "Of course I do. Over 700 years ago, the continent of Lauren originally had only one human nation, the Gondar Empire, located in the center of the continent. Historical records describe it as the most powerful empire on the continent at the time, so much so that even the Silver Empire established by the elves in the south of the continent did not dare to easily oppose it. But later, the other sea that surrounds this world became turbulent, causing a great disaster on the continent of Lauren known as the Dark Tide. The epicenter of the disaster was in the heartland of the Gondar Empire. Almost overnight, the capital of the Gondar Empire and a third of its territory were swallowed by the magic tide and disintegrated by the surging elemental forces. Though uninterrupted, it wasn't overnight, in fact. The process lasted for nearly a month. The court mages of Gondar didn't just do nothing in the face of the magic tide. He then gestured for her to continue, but looking at the result, it was pretty much the same. You may continue. Rebecca blushed slightly, as if being checked on her homework by a parent, and continued more cautiously, oh. After that, the magic tide in the heartland of the Gondar Empire continued to spread outwards, and eventually completely destroyed the entire nation. This was the collapse of the Gondar Empire. And after that, as the other sea gradually calmed down, the power of the magic tide began to weaken, and the surviving remnants of Gondar began to rebuild their civilization. Since the central region of the continent had become a complete mess and was no longer suitable for human habitation, they left the ruined empire under the leadership of a group of pioneers and began to pioneer in 4 directions: east, south, west, and north. This is known in history as the Second Pioneering. You, ancestor, were one of the most famous pioneer knights of that time. Gawain casually praised her. Your history is good. Then you should have heard that although the magic tide ended, a large number of monsters born in the magic tide still lurked in the ruins of the Gondar Empire. Those monsters were one of the greatest threats faced by humanity during the Second Pioneering. Hetty's eyes wide, and you mean to say? Gawain sighed. That's right, those were the things we fought back then. They were born from the magic tide, with a silhouette resembling that of humans, but they were definitely not human. After the Gondar Empire collapsed, a large number of such monsters poured out from the ruined heartland of the empire, spreading in all directions and hunting down the survivors of that time. So the first half of the Second Pioneering was less of a pioneering journey and more of an escape. And even after we left the wastelands of the empire and established a new nation on the edge of the continent, those monsters didn't stop. They kept coming from the direction of the imperial wastelands, frequently attacking the defense lines of the civilized world. In the first 10 years after the founding of Ansu, I dealt with them almost every day. Rebecca's eyes wide and seemingly captivated by these ancient and legendary stories. So the monsters stopped appearing 10 years after the founding of Ansu? Gaul unsmiled, reached out and stroked the young girl's hair, with a smile as if looking at a silly road ear. Silly child, that's when your ancestor died. Rebecca was speechless. Although he had only been with this nominal great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter for less than a day, Gawain still had a very deep impression of Rebecca, and more than once he suspected that the child's head had been clamped by something when she was young. Logically, it shouldn't be the case. Even setting aside the elite education that noble children must receive, her identity as a spellcaster was almost proof enough of her intelligence. After all, casually conjuring a large fireball was not something an ordinary person could master. As for the others, at this moment, they were not in the mood to pursue Rebecca's thoughtless words. Even Hetty, who was usually very strict with Rebecca, was now filled with deep worry. You're saying the monsters that appeared in the Cecil territory are the same ones from 700 years ago? Gawain sighed. Judging by how unfamiliar you all are with those monsters, I imagine you haven't seen them for several hundred years. Hetty gently shook her head. The pioneering period and the ensuing years of war against the monsters are now history. Although it's recorded in the history books, the most recent records are at least 600 years old. According to the knowledge I've learned, the monsters wandering out from the wastelands of the old empire did indeed harass Ansu for a long time, but ever since the elves helped humans build those sentinel towers, those monsters have become nothing more than a legend. Gawain frowned slightly. Sentinel towers, things built by elves, don't fail so easily. Rebecca suddenly clenched her fists and said with a serious expression, "This must be reported to His Majesty the King." Monsters that disappeared hundreds of years ago have suddenly reappeared within the Empire's borders. Someone must quickly get this intelligence back, and the Cecil territory has suffered greatly from this unprovoked disaster. We must ask the royal family for help. Gawain thought about his own past achievements and said with a confident smile, "Don't worry, with the Cecil family status in Ansu and the influence I left behind, I'm sure St. Sunil City will spare no effort to help you rebuild your territory." But unexpectedly, as soon as he said this, instead of showing relief, the expressions on Hetty and Rebecca's faces became unusually strange. Gawain was completely bewildered. What's wrong? Could it be that after 700 years, the name of the legendary founding Grand Duke, Gawain Cecil, was no longer recognized in this country? Hetty's face looked exceptionally grim. She bit her lip hard several times as if she had finally made up her mind. Ancestor. Actually, back in the tomb, I wanted to tell you some things, but I really couldn't bring myself to say them. Gawain had a faint inkling of what was coming, but he still nodded. Go on, I'm listening. Hetty said, "The glory of the Cecil family is no longer what it once was, although you are still considered the legendary founding Grand Duke by the entire kingdom." But She looked at Rebecca with some difficulty, but the one who now inherits the family title, Rebecca, is merely a Viscountess, and this Cecil territory is the last piece of land the family owns. Gawain was dumbfounded. What? As I recall, I was already a duke when I died, and the title was hereditary, wasn't it? And the territory stretched all the way from the Cecil lands to the Holy Spirit Plains. What on earth did the later Cecil descendants do? Assassinate the king or stage a rebellion? Hetty lowered her head in shame. A lot can happen in 700 years to the family and to this country. The Ansu of today is no longer the first dynasty, but the second dynasty, and the Cecil family is no longer a major vassal supporting the royal family, but a disgraced and exiled house. Rebecca, standing beside her, took over from Hetty 100 years ago. The last king of the Ansu First Dynasty, Darien I, died of a sudden illness without leaving an heir. At that time, the royal family was already fraught with internal conflicts, and even Darien I's own right to the throne was disputed. After the king's death, the queen and the regent failed to control the situation in time, which led to the Mist Moon disturbance. She continued. Royal family members with collateral succession rights fought for the throne during the Mist Moon of Ansu year 635. In the third week after Mist Moon, the court's struggles escalated into a civil war, and various royal members and the great nobles behind them began to engage in direct armed conflict. The Cecil family was also drawn into it. She added the root of the disaster was Marquis Grumman. The Duke of Cecil at the time was old but still very healthy, and his relationship with his eldest son, Gawain Cecil, was very tense. Marquis Grumman probably sensed a crisis, so he secretly plotted and participated in the civil war of that year. Because he had not yet inherited the family's power and lacked sufficient influence, Marquis Grumman set his sights on the legendary ancestor. Don clutched his forehead. I remember now. He's the one who took my shield, right? Hetty nodded and continued for Rebecca. Marquis Grumman first placed the Duke of Cecil at the time under house arrest, then took your holy relic, the shield of the Ansu Kingdom's guardian, from the ancestral tomb. He then, in the name of the Cecil family heir, declared his support for Prince Tuor SH. In March of the same year, Prince Tuor SH was assassinated. Subsequently, Marquis Grumman swiftly declared his support for Prince Fidi K. In April of the same year, Prince Fidi K was defeated in battle and committed suicide. Gawain was speechless. But that wasn't all. Hetty had more to say. After that, Marquis Grumman sought out an uncle of Darien II. He used his exceptional eloquence to form an alliance. But in the following month, the great northern Duke, Brunwild, who had not interfered in the civil war, suddenly pushed a young boy onto the stage and declared that the boy was the illegitimate son of the previous king's predecessor. The Northern Duke then used this as a bargaining chip to participate in the civil war, and in the Mist Moon of Ansu year 636, he ended the war. On the eve of the war's end, Marquis Grumman tried to repeat his old trick and declare fealty to the new king, but before he could issue the statement, he was attacked on the battlefield by both friend and foe simultaneously and died under a flurry of blades. She concluded, after that, King the Ansu Second Dynasty. Of course, the term Second Dynasty is still a rather sensitive topic today. At this point, Amber, who had been listening quietly on the side, suddenly said leisurely the whole farce lasted only a year, yet it reshuffled the entire kingdom's order. Who on the entire continent doesn't know this piece of history? Hetty said, because the one who ultimately ascended the throne was an illegitimate son, this war is also privately called the War of the Bastard. The number of great nobles involved in the civil war was large, so quite a few families were implicated. But in the end, this was still part of the rules of the nobility. Furthermore, in the early days of the Second Dynasty, the country was extremely chaotic, and the new king urgently needed to restore order, which required the power of the old nobility. Therefore, most families were not completely wiped out, except for... Gawain's mouth couldn't help but twitch. Except for the ones who jumped around the most, right? This whole piece of history made him, an elder who had looked down on the mortal world for over 100,000 years, feel extremely uncomfortable. He could only lament that life was indeed stranger than fiction. At least fiction had some basic logic. How could that Marquis Grumman be so gifted? I suppose there's no one more capable of stirring up trouble than Gawain Cecil, right? Hetty lowered her head. After that, the Cecil family never recovered. The family's fate could have been worse, but your reputation and the efforts of the old Duke back and managed to preserve the family's bloodline and its last small foundation. It's just that since then the name Cecil could no longer be at the center of the kingdom. As you can see, Gaul unfollowed Hetty's gaze and looked at Miss Rebecca Cecil, whose head had been clamped by a door. Rebecca noticed Gawain's gaze and turned her head. Ancestor? Gawain unclutched his forehead. A misfortune to the family, a great misfortune. Although he wasn't the true ancestor of the Cecil family, the splendor of Marquis Grumman's achievements and the bizarreness of his deeds were so shocking to hear and tear-jerking to see that even just listening to it made him sigh with emotion. And that good-for-nothing descendant even lost my shield. Hetty and Rebecca were speechless. The ancestor was cursing their great-grandfather again. As the younger generation, it was best to keep quiet. Fortunately, Gawain was not the actual person involved in the event. He quickly adjusted his mindset, which in Hetty's eyes became a sign of great magnanimity and tolerance. He then shook his head slightly anyway. Dwelling on these past events won't help the current situation. Regardless, those repairing monsters are a huge threat to the human world. The king in Saint Sunil City may not care about the declining Cecil family, but he cannot ignore those monsters. Therefore, he must also pay attention to us who escaped from this disaster. Hetty nodded forcefully. You are absolutely right. After this, Gawain lost the mood to talk. The dim and cramped underground passage wore down everyone's desire for conversation, and all that was left was to hurry on. Fortunately, the straight underground tunnel allowed for the fastest passage through the entire Cecil territory, and the nearest exit was not too far from the castle. After traveling for some time, Gawain judged from his memories that they had reached a suitable exit. Thanks to the blessing of the earth elementals, the ancient tunnel stairs showed no signs of collapse, and it was quite fortunate that the exit was not completely buried by earth and rock. After clearing away some roots, vines, and loose soil that were blocking the exit, fresh air finally blew on everyone's faces after a long time. They saw the light of day again. Knight, Byron lead the soldiers out of the opening first. After they gave the all-clear signal, the others followed out one by one. After climbing to the ground, Rebecca immediately took a deep breath and then exclaimed joyfully in a low voice, "We're out." Gaul unfollowed Rebecca to the surface, his excitement no less than hers, perhaps even greater. A vast world. His first reaction was to raise his head and look at the sky. Unfortunately, the world outside was currently in the dead of night, but thanks to the darkness, he could see the starry sky of this other world for the first time. A faint white light was already appearing on the horizon. The approach of dawn made the starlight in the sky appear thin and dim. The scattered stars all seemed to be veiled in a layer of mist, hazy and distant. They were completely unfamiliar constellations. The white light on the horizon was growing brighter. The night had passed and dawn was breaking. Everyone who had escaped from the underground tunnel was immersed in the joy of surviving a catastrophe. Gawain, in particular, faced the direction of the rising sun with a strange sense of joy and excitement. He opened his arms as if to embrace the sun of this new world. Then he saw an unprecedentedly huge, glowing arc, emitting a faint light mist, gradually rise above the horizon and cast its brilliance upon the world. That was not the sun. Gawain stared at the horizon for a long time. For the first few minutes, the immense cognitive dissonance made it impossible for him to even guess what he was seeing. Whatever it was a far cry from the sun he knew. That wide, magnificent arc continued to rise, and its initial ascent was much faster than a sunrise. In just a short while, Gawain could see a small portion of its curved surface. The arc was indeed emitting light with a hazy coloration at its edges and an indistinct, cloud-like structure. The light and heat of this world must have come from this object, but its glow wasn't as blinding as the sun's. In fact, it was the opposite. Gawain could not only look directly at the arc, but could even make out some faint patterns on its surface. After roughly estimating the object's curvature, Gawain realized this was something with a visual diameter dozens, or even hundreds of times larger than the sun. Of course, its actual size must have been smaller than a normal star. It was just incredibly close to the ground. At this distance, if it fully rose, it would perhaps obscure about a fifth of the sky. Of course, this was just Gawain's rough sensory impression, as the impact he felt was so great that his intuitive judgments were inevitably subject to large errors. The oppressive feeling of watching a colossal celestial body rise before one's eyes is difficult to put into words. He quickly searched Gawain Cecil's memories and, sure enough, found countless instances of the same spectacular sunrise. The thing in the sky was not some abnormal celestial phenomenon, but the most ordinary sight in this world. So, what was the explanation? Gawain quickly formulated several interpretations based on the knowledge he possessed. Perhaps it was because the physical laws of this world were drastically different from those of his home universe, making the star's light and heat efficiency quite low, and the planet he was on was very close to its star, thus allowing him to see such a massive sun while the Earth wasn't scorched. Or maybe it wasn't a sun at all, but a hole that emitted light and heat radiation, or some other completely unscientific but very magical contraption. But it was more likely that the planet he was on did not orbit a sun, but revolved around a gas giant. It wasn't a planet at all, but the latter's satellite. The thing rising in the sky was the parent planet of this moon. At that moment, the feeling of being in an alien land was stronger for Gawain than it had ever been before. Hetty's voice came from his side. Ancestor? Ancestor? This finally startled Gawain out of his dazed and contemplative state. Gawain snapped back to reality a lot. He looked at his great-granddaughter with some apprehension. Having left the dark, cramped, and perilous underground tunnel, the beautiful noblewoman had regained some of her former grace. She gave Gawain a slight curtsy. Ancestor, you were just spacing out, but we need to leave this place first. Gawain mumbled a couple of vague replies to brush it off, only then noticing that the tunnel exit was on an exposed small hill. Standing foolishly here when the surrounding situation was unknown was certainly not a wise move. So he nodded. Let's find some high ground first to check the nearby situation. What I know is the terrain from 700 years ago. It might not be useful today. and so the group headed towards a nearby slope under Gawain's direction. Along the way, Gawain couldn't help but look up at the massive sun several more times. Rebecca, walking behind Gawain, couldn't help but ask with some concern, "Ancestor, you keep looking at the sun, you know. Is there a problem?" Amber chimed in casually from the side, "Your old ancestor was asleep for 700 years without seeing the light of day. Now that he finally sees the sun, of course he's going to take a few extra looks." Gawain ignored Amber and glanced at his N+1 great-granddaughter, shaking his head slightly. In his heart, he confirmed what the locals of this world called the thing in the sky. It was indeed called the sun. Or rather, no matter how the word was pronounced, in the minds of the people of this world, the object it referred to was the sun and nothing else. Gawain once again searched the memories of this body's original owner. After several attempts with keywords and vague information, he finally felt something and raised his head, looking towards the other side of the sky that was still somewhat dim. In that sky, not yet fully bright and still dotted with many stars, he found a star about the size of a grain of rice, brighter than all the others. The humans of this world called that special star Atom and had endowed it with many symbolic meanings in religion and magical rituals. The previous two guesses could probably be dismissed, only the third guess was plausible. Hey, was the star of the solar system, incredibly distant, its light falling upon the land beneath Gawain's feet, almost as cold as the other starlight. And in the cool morning breeze, Gawain climbed to the top of the hill. A vast expanse of land, burned by the flames of war and showing a strange, festering state, lay in the distance. As if strong acid had been splashed on flesh, the land was rotten and unsightly. Large patches of rock and soil had turned a grayish black, with cracks spreading everywhere. The vegetation on the land had long been corrupted, and the remaining tree trunks were all twisted into a demonic state, like the claws of a devil. Further away, one could see collapsed ramparts, scorched houses, and the ancient castle of the Cecil family shrouded in smoke and dust. Giant, abomination-like monsters wandered that wasteland. The fields and crops had long been annihilated in the magic, tides stirred up by the monsters completely indistinguishable. Rebecca lay on the slope, biting her lip so hard that her eyes reddened. She said, "The family's territory." Tears of either anger or sorrow welled up. At this moment, the young girl who had just inherited her family's estate and had not even adapted to the identity of a lord seemed to have lost everything. Gawain sighed. This is what land corrupted by the magic tide looks like. Back then, the Gondar Empire was corrupted from the inside out, just like this. I guess that corruption still lingers in the wastelands of the old empire to this day. And now new corruption has appeared in the lands of civilization. Amber broke out in a cold sweat by the shadow god. We were surrounded by these things all along. Hetty, however, was thinking about the possibility of the family's recovery. Is there still any hope? Gawain shook his head. There's no hope. You failed to stop the abomination's attack. They have already formed a group presence, and the elemental contamination caused by the resulting magic tide is irreversible. Even if all the monsters are eliminated, the pollution lingering on this land will persist for a very long time. Hetty still seemed to be holding on to some hope. How long will it last? Gawain asked a seemingly unrelated question. Has human civilization returned to the lands of the Gondar Empire yet? It is still a forbidden zone for all life. No one dares to set foot on the land on the other side of the Grand Barrier. Gawain shrugged. Then it seems the corruption of the Cecil territory will last for at least 700 years. Rebecca and Hetty looked at their ancestor with some astonishment. They couldn't understand how this great figure, who had founded the Cecil family, could remain so calm in the face of the destruction of the family's last piece of land. There was neither anger nor sorrow, as if he were watching something that had nothing to do with him. This attitude even frightened them a little. However, Gawain soon noticed the looks in their eyes and took the initiative to ask, "Is there a problem?" Rebecca asked cautiously, "Ancestor, aren't you angry? This is the last piece of land of the Cecil family." Gawain was taken aback, immediately realizing that he still hadn't fully slipped into his role and had exposed a flaw. He quickly put on a stern face and mustered all his acting skills. Wallowing in these things is of no help. Gawain Cecil is a pioneer. Every inch of land and wealth of this family was built by me from scratch. If the territory is gone, it's gone. At worst, we'll find a new place to pioneer. What's with all the sentimentality? Hetty and Rebecca nodded repeatedly, filled with admiration for their old ancestor. They thought to themselves, truly a legendary ancestor. His vision and magnanimity are indeed different. They just didn't know where the ancestor planned to go pioneering in this era where all land has been divided up by the existing noble system and the noun lands are basically all forbidden zones. Gawain quickly changed the subject. There's nothing more to see here. We need to plan our journey next. The first step is to find a town, then find a way to meet up with the group that broke out earlier. I remember it was a knight named Philip who led the breakout, right? Did you arrange a rendezvous point? Rebecca quickly answered. We agreed on Tanzan town to the north. If Tanzan is also attacked by monsters, we'll continue north along the kingdom's main road. Gawain nodded and was about to leave when a strange feeling suddenly made him stop. After a moment's pause, he and the nearby knight Byron shouted, almost simultaneously, "Get down, hide!" Although they didn't know why, Rebecca and Hetty immediately followed Knight Byron and hid behind a large nearby rock. The moment Gawain spoke, Amber had already into the shadows and disappeared into some unknown corner. Gawain followed Rebecca to take cover, but suddenly saw the somewhat dazed little scullery maid, Betty, still standing there with her frying pan, looking completely lost. He lunged out and pulled her back, and at almost the same instant, a heart-stopping sense of pressure descended from the sky. In the light of the gradually rising giant sun, an elegant and massive creature slowly flew across the sky. It was a giant dragon, dozens of meters long. In her terror, Hetty subconsciously cast a third-tier spell, Refractive Field, concealing everyone's figures. But she had no confidence that this crude spell could deceive the eyes of a legendary creature. But the giant dragon indeed did not notice the people on the ground, or perhaps it simply disdained to pay them any mind. Here she just slowly flapped its wings, flying across the sky with elegance and majesty. Its huge eyes reflected the land of the Cecil territory, destroyed by the magic tide. Then it breathed a mouthful of salt-flavored soda, oh, a breath weapon, and burned the place down. Dragon. This creature hadn't appeared in the mortal world for a very long time, in fact. For the vast majority of intelligent races on the continent of Lauren, dragons were creatures that existed somewhere between myth and reality. They clearly knew of the existence of these powerful beings, but basically no one would ever get to see a real dragon in their lifetime. This excluded those mystical and exceptionally long-lived elves of the south. With their long lifespans, the elves were well qualified to call themselves witnesses to history. In the long history of the Elven Empire, there were indeed one or two records of dealings with dragons. The elegant and powerful creature with deep blue scales and enormous wings flew across the sky, raining down its deadly breath. The pillar of fire, already glowing white-hot, contained ancient draconic magic, its power far exceeding that of simple flames. Wherever the pillar of fire swept, the earth burst into roaring flames which continued to burn and spread without fuel. After just a few breaths, the entire Cecil territory was completely engulfed in a sea of fire. After doing all this, the giant dragon circled the area for a little while longer, as if inspecting the results of its work before finally beating its wings and flying high into the sky, disappearing into the gradually brightening clouds. Gon heard several deep breaths from beside him. Everyone, including Hetty, only now dared to take a deep breath. If that dragon had lingered any longer, who knows which of them would have been the first to suffocate and pass out. Rebecca clutched her staff, muttering to herself, a dragon, a dragon. Ancestor, I saw a dragon. Gaul uncleared his throat. You don't have to tell me I saw it too. Only then did Rebecca snap back to her senses, giving Gaul an embarrassed look before turning her gaze to the Cecil territory with a complicated expression. Ravaged once by the magic tide and burned once by dragon fire, this place was now completely beyond saving. As for those monsters, although they were quite a handful for the inept guards of the Cecil territory, they were ultimately nothing more than the lowest tier abominations. Under the dragon's fire, almost all of them had been reduced to ashes. Even if a few survived, their self-disintegration in the drastically changed environment was only a matter of time. Even the taciturn Knight Byron couldn't help but speak up. I thought dragons only appeared in legends. The three soldiers beside him were still trembling too much to stand up. The usually strict knight didn't reprimand them this time, but simply frowned, "My lord, have you ever dealt with a dragon before?" Gon shook his head. No, dragons are very mysterious creatures. Even 700 years ago, when half the continent of Lauren was in turmoil, they never interfered in mortal affairs. Although he said this, Gon wasn't overly shocked by the giant creatures. Because he had seen dragons from another perspective, during his days suspended in the sky, he had seen these creatures appear on the continent more than once. However, dragons were indeed mysterious. Even though Gon had been hanging in the sky for who knows how many tens of thousands of years, the number of dragons he saw was quite limited, and the images were fragmented and trivial, so he couldn't summarize much about their characteristics or habits. At that moment, the shadow beside Gon suddenly flickered twice. He turned his head and sure enough saw Amber standing behind him. The half-elf girl still looked quite shaken. Amber exclaimed, "I saw a dragon. My mother will never believe this, I saw a dragon. It was at big." Gon glared at the timid and noisy thief. All right, everyone here saw it. Where did you run off to just now?" Amber said, puffing out her chest. "I was hiding in a crack in a nearby rock. My escape skills are top-notch." Gon sighed, covering his forehead. "Master level shadow affinity, but your combat ability is barely better than a goose's, and you're proud of it." He then shook his head. "This is no place to linger. Let's leave quickly." He started to walk down the hill. Although the dragon had left, who knew what other strange things might pop up, so leaving as soon as possible was the best course of action. But Hetty looked at the family territory with a complicated expression one last time. "Ancestor, that dragon burned our territory." Gon glanced at Hetty. "It burned our ruins. Strictly speaking, it burned those monsters." He had been watching carefully when the dragon released its breath. It was mostly aimed at the areas with the highest concentration of monsters. Although he didn't know why it missed several times, its targeting tendency was quite obvious. The Cecil territory was gone before that dragon arrived. But Gon shrugged. "Are you planning to seek justice from a dragon? Let's be realistic." If you really want to do something, it's to get back to civilized society as soon as possible and report everything about the monsters and the dragon. Hetty couldn't argue and could only nod yes. Actually, Gawain understood Hetty's feelings very well. The Cecil territory was her hometown, the place where she was born and raised. Although her hometown was destroyed, the emotional hurdle was not so easy to overcome. Even though she knew the giant dragon was just setting a fire on the ruins, and this fire was very likely to burn those monsters, she still felt a bit awkward. After all, it was like desecrating a corpse in front of her. But understanding was one thing. Gawain found it hard to put himself in her shoes. After all, until he crawled out of the coffin, he wasn't the old ancestor of this Cecil family. With a variety of chaotic feelings, the group left the area. Next, a dense forest stood in their way. Hetty held her staff in one hand and sketched a few flickering moons in the air with the other, then looked up towards the dense forest. We have to go through this forest to get back to the main road. It's the only way to Tanzan town. Gawain watched the rune shining in Hetty's hand with a curious and envious expression which he tried hard to conceal. Magic really is a convenient thing. Hetty was a bit puzzled, then her expression turned somewhat fearful. Ancestor? Did my skills displease you? Gawain was taken aback. Huh? Why would I be displeased? Hetty explained nervously, the Cecil family has always established itself through the strength of knights. Martial arts and horsemanship are the family's orthodox path. Those like Rebecca and me who have walked the path of a mage. If this were over 100 years ago, forget about succession rights. We probably would have had trouble even finding a place in the family. It's just that, since the incident 100 years ago, the family status has plummeted and our numbers have dwindled. Descendants who can master extraordinary powers are scarce, so paths other than that of a knight have finally been recognized. But in any case, this violates the family's rules. Gawain said casually who made this stupid rule. As a person with an open mind, he had always despised this kind of typical, pedantic family rule. But to his surprise, as soon as he said this, the atmosphere on the scene suddenly became subtle. Knight Byron immediately lowered his head and pretended to tie his shoelaces, even though he was wearing a pair of iron boots. Hetty was stunned on the spot, and after 2 seconds, Rebecca immediately raised her finger and pointed at Gawain himself. Gawain was speechless. He searched his memory. It seems there was such a thing back then. The young and vigorous great hero, Gawain Cecil, after a triumphant return, was drinking celebratory wine with the founding monarch of the Ansu Kingdom, Charlie I. The two good buddies were boasting after getting drunk, discussing how the great cause was about to be accomplished. The group of people who had led their clansmen to flee to the north back then had now all become pioneering heroes, founding figures. It was foreseeable that in the near future, a large wave of first-generation nobles would emerge, and as long as they could live and reproduce behind these first-generation nobles with no foundation to speak of, a series of ancient families with long traditions and pure bloodlines would be born. So the two drunk founding monarch and minister got together and thought, maybe they should get a head start on standardization and establish some family rules and maxims to prevent their descendants from forgetting the spirit of their ancestors. And as the pioneer among pioneers, the founder among founders, Gawain Cecil and Charlie I should undoubtedly set an example. So 700 years ago, Gawain Cecil downed a large glass of strong liquor, glanced at the knight's sword at his waist, and with a flourish of his brush on the table, left a line of words. Knights are more awesome than mages. Upon seeing this, Charlie I was greatly gratified, and so he also wrote a line with a flourish of his brush. What Lord Gawain said is right. The former became the Cecil family's ancestral precept. The latter was vetoed by Charlie I's attendants and remonstrating officials. The ministers who were thinking of the bigger picture, and the king who had sobered up, certainly wouldn't list such drunken ramblings as a basic national policy. But Gawain Cecil had seriously listed his heartfelt thoughts at the time in his family rules. Emerging from his memory bank, Gawain looked at Hetty and Rebecca with an embarrassed expression. He's like, I was drunk back then, just pretend that rule doesn't exist. Hetty and Rebecca asked. Just then, a rumbling sound from Amber's stomach next to them finally saved Gawain from his predicament. The half-elf girl rubbed her stomach embarrassed lie. I know it's a bit inappropriate to say this while you're all having a family reunion, but I'm a little hungry. And Amber's stomach rolling seemed to be a starting signal. As soon as she finished speaking, several more sounds of rumbling stomachs came from everyone present. Even Gawain was no exception. It was only at this moment that Gawain realized that since leaving that dark tomb, everyone present had gone a long time without food. And the time he had gone without food was especially longer than anyone else's. The last time he had enjoyed the satisfaction of chewing food, the monkeys on the continent of Lauren were far from being able to walk upright. Venturing into another world is not a romantic affair. Between the exciting ruins, magic, giant beasts, and heroic stories, there are more practical problems that one must face, such as sleeping in the wild and figuring out how to fill one's stomach. The journey of escape was rushed at every turn, especially given that the castle had been breached and they had fought to the death with the last few personal guards until the very last moment. No one could have had the time to prepare a bag full of dry rations. Moreover, the place where everyone had last departed from was the ancestral tomb, which didn't look like a place where food would be stored. So as soon as Amber's stomach crumbled, everyone realized the pressing reality of the problem. The surrounding area was a barren wasteland, bare without even a blade of grass. Opposite the hill was the Cecil territory, now a sea of fire and ruins. But a little further down the hill there was a dense forest. In this place, which was in a magical version of the Middle Ages, a dense forest outside of a town was synonymous with danger. Where the light of civilization could not reach, there were either beasts, bandits, or monsters. But a dense forest also meant one other thing: there would be more food. And to get to Tanzam Town to the north, they had to go through this dense forest anyway. The group found a flat, open area at the edge of the forest to rest for a while, then began to assign people to find food. Gawain first glanced at the dazed little scullery maid. This little girl named Betty really lacked presence, but she was surprisingly brave. She hadn't even been scared to tears when the dragon flew over earlier, though it was also possible she was so scared she was just frozen. At this moment, the little girl was still tightly gripping her frying pan, standing there a little nervously. When she noticed Gawain's gaze, she shrank her neck slightly. Gawain began. Betty, Hetty, Rebecca, you three stay here. Byron, you stay as a guard. The rest of you come hunting with me. That includes you, Amber. Betty had no combat ability. Although Hetty and Rebecca were different as mages, they were not suited for chasing wild animals in the forest. Moreover, they were greatly exhausted and had not had a chance to meditate and recover since the battle in the castle. This was a fatal problem for spellcasters who needed to be in a good mental state to be effective, so it was better for them to stay behind and guard the camp. If they could recover their mana as soon as possible, they would have more fighting strength for the journey ahead. The three loyal family soldiers certainly had no complaints about these arrangements, but Amber's eyes widened. Why do I have to go to? I'm tired too. Gawain glared at her. Feel your ears. You've got half an elf's blood in you. Aren't you ashamed to say your ancestors lived in trees if you don't come hunting in the forest with me? Amber pouted, full of resentment. That's racial prejudice. Who told you that elves have to hunt in the forest? I learned stealth, not tracking. You dug up my grave. Amber said, all right, fine. Gawain laid three soldiers and a half-elf who claimed she couldn't hunt into the forest, leaving the loyal knight Byron and the three ladies to guard the temporary camp. After setting up some warding rooms with what little mana she had left, Hetty sat down on a rock, exhausted. Meanwhile, Rebecca ate Betty on a circuit within Knight Byron's guard perimeter and then returned with a small bundle of dry branches she had found nearby. After piling the branches on the ground, Rebecca stepped back a couple of paces, raised her staff, and chanted the most basic fire-starting incantation. An unstable, explosive fireball began to form in the air. Hetty managed to stop her before the fireball exploded. Never mind, I'll do it. After lighting the bonfire with a more normal magical flame, the chill that had accumulated in the underground tunnel and the early morning wind was finally driven out of their bodies. Hetty sighed in relief and looked at Rebecca with some exasperation. When are you ever going to learn a spell other than fireball? Rebecca lowered her head in shame. I'm sorry, Aunt. Hetty rubbed her forehead, even more exasperated. Don't look so pathetic, so easily, even when you're apologizing. Don't lower your head like that. You're a person who has inherited a title, you know? Your performance today, honestly, the ancestor is probably very disappointed, although he didn't show it. Rebecca immediately became nervous. Then what should I do? Hetty was taken aback for a moment, then sighed. Sigh, what can be done? Looking at the state of the family now, probably no Cecil descendant could satisfy the ancestor. Our current state is really too unworthy of the family's former glory. Rebecca pursed her lips tightly. For her, who had grown up following the conventional path of a noble's child, the series of recent events had all far exceeded her understanding. No teacher had ever told her how to face these things, neither the attack of the magic tide and monsters, nor the fact that her old ancestor had climbed out of his coffin. All of this left the young Viscountess at a complete loss. After a moment of silence, Rebecca finally mustered her courage. And do you think the ancestor, has he really been resurrected? Hetty looked into Rebecca's eyes. She could easily guess what her niece was thinking. Are you doubting the ancestor, or are you doubting the ancestor's resurrection? Actually, I know I shouldn't doubt, but this matter is really a bit hard to believe. Hetty shook her head. I feel the same way, but the facts are right in front of us. Remember the first lesson every magic apprentice has to learn. It's not some theoretical knowledge or magic formula, but a maxim. Truth may run counter to common sense, but truth is always the truth. This saying also holds true in fields outside of magic. Seeing Rebecca fall into thought, Hetty added in a low voice, no matter what the reason for the ancestor's awakening from his long sleep, the fact of the Cecil family's ancestor's resurrection must be a fact. Betty glanced at her two mistresses and found that she couldn't understand a word of their conversation, so she lowered her head and continued to stare blankly at her precious frying pan. Soon, Gawain, who had gone hunting, returned with the 3 soldiers and 1 amber. The catch was not abundant, but it was still satisfactory. They brought back 3 rabbits and 2 large birds with magnificent feathers whose names they didn't know. They also picked a large pile of various wild fruits. Filling their stomach should not be a problem. Watching Amber skillfully and proficiently process the carcasses of the prey, Gawain uncurled his lip. Still say, you can't hunt? Your skills are as adept as a gray elf from the Moss Wood. The Mosswood is a vast forest on the border between the Ansu Kingdom and the Ogre tribal nation to the west. The Grey Elves, a subspecies of elves who live in the Mosswood, are considered the best hunters in the world. In terms of tracking prey in a dense forest, they are even better than the Wood Elves. After realizing that he really needed to brush up on the common knowledge of this world, Gawain would flip through the memory bank in his mind whenever he had free time. He had just found this piece of knowledge and was now applying it here.